In a quiet, picturesque town nestled between rolling hills, a new family dynamic begins to unfold. Mrs. Smith, a woman in her late 40s, has recently married Mr. Smith, a wealthy and well-respected local businessman. They have settled into a grand, elegant house, a stark contrast to the modest home Emily, Mr. Smith's stepdaughter, has grown up in. Emily, a confident and independent young woman in her early 20s, is well-educated, sharp-witted, and determined to carve out her own future. Though she harbours no ill feelings toward her stepmother, she cannot ignore the growing tension in the household. Since the marriage, Mrs. Smith has become increasingly possessive and insecure, worried that Emily's presence in the family might one day threaten her own position, particularly when it comes to money and inheritance. Deep down, Mrs. Smith fears that Emily's natural charm and intelligence could make her a potential heir to Mr. Smith's wealth, leaving her with nothing. As a result, Mrs. Smith starts to concoct a plan to secure her own future by marrying Emily off to a man of little means. This would ensure Emily's dependence on the family, preventing her from gaining any financial independence. Mrs. Smith's plan was calculated and cold, a product of her growing insecurity and fear of losing control. She had spent enough time in the town to know that there was a young man who might be the perfect pawn in her scheme, a hard-working mechanic named James. James was in his mid-20s, tall, with a kind face and an earnest manner that made him well-liked in the community. However, James lacked the wealth and status that Mrs. Smith deemed necessary for someone to be a suitable match for her stepdaughter. It didn't matter to her that James was intelligent, decent, and had dreams of a better life. What mattered was that he was poor, and marrying Emily to him would keep her tethered to the family, unable to break free and pursue any future of her own. Mrs. Smith began her plans subtly, carefully planting seeds of doubt in Emily's mind. Emily had always been independent, disinterested in the idea of marriage, especially one that was arranged or based on financial gain, but Mrs. Smith saw this as an opportunity. She would tell Emily that her future prospects were limited and that the best she could hope for was a simple, peaceful life. The idea of loneliness, something Emily never worried about, became a recurring theme in Mrs. Smith's conversations. She would say things like, "You know, dear, all your friends are getting married. James is a hard-working young man, and he would be a good husband to you. What else could you want?" At first, Emily resisted, laughing off her stepmother's suggestions. She had always believed that marriage was something built on love, not convenience. She didn't want to be pressured into a life she didn't want, especially to someone she had no romantic feelings for. Yet, Mrs. Smith was relentless, and soon her words began to sink in, cleverly disguised as advice and concern. Mrs. Smith would flatter James constantly, speaking about his strength of character, his work ethic, and how he had a good heart. She praised him for his hands-on skills in the mechanic shop, how he could fix anything from cars to broken fences, and how well he got along with the townspeople. She made Emily feel as though James was the ideal man for her, despite his lack of wealth. Mrs. Smith would often drop little comments about how James was so dependable, always on time for work, and how much he cared for his family. But it was when she started to compare him to the wealthy men Emily might meet, who were often arrogant, distant, and preoccupied with status, that the manipulation became more obvious. "A rich man might never appreciate your true worth," Mrs. Smith would say. "They have too much on their plate, too many things to worry about. James, on the other hand, will treat you like a queen. He's humble and real, someone who will always be there for you." Mrs. Smith knew exactly how to exploit Emily's sense of justice. Emily had grown up watching her mother struggle and had always vowed she wouldn't marry someone who wasn't emotionally available or sincere. But she wasn't looking for a man with money. She wanted someone who respected her independence and intelligence. Slowly, Mrs. Smith wore Emily down, feeding her doubts and fears about the future. She would remind her that she wasn't getting any younger and that time was ticking for any woman in a small town to find a decent husband. "What if you never meet someone better?" "What if you wait too long?" Mrs. Smith would say, her tone smooth and convincing. "James is a good match and he'll make you happy. Besides, you don't need much when you have love." As weeks passed, Emily's resistance waned. She had never considered James in a romantic light, but his quiet demeanour and dedication to his work were admirable. Mrs. Smith's relentless persuasion began to blur the lines between friendship and courtship, convincing Emily that James could be a steady, reliable partner. She began to feel guilty for not considering someone who had always been kind to her and her family, even if he lacked the wealth and lifestyle she had always imagined for herself. What Mrs. Smith didn't anticipate, however, was Emily's growing discomfort with the idea of being manipulated. While she was feeling pressure from her stepmother, she couldn't shake the nagging sense that her happiness and future were being dictated by someone else's selfish desires. Emily started to see through Mrs. Smith's intentions, realizing that the entire situation wasn't about her well-being. It was about Mrs. Smith keeping control over her life and ensuring that she wouldn't become a threat to her own place in the family. But Mrs. Smith's scheme wasn't over yet. She continued her quiet campaign, pressing Emily toward James, convincing her that this was her only chance at a safe future, one that would keep her in the family fold, under Mrs. Smith's control. The pressure was mounting, but Emily wasn't ready to succumb, at least not yet. Emily had always prided herself on being independent and intelligent, qualities that had defined her throughout her life. From a young age, she had been taught the importance of self-reliance, never allowing anyone, least of all her stepmother, to dictate her path. But as the weeks passed, and Mrs. Smith's manipulative tactics grew more relentless, Emily began to feel cornered. She knew deep down that her stepmother's concern wasn't for her happiness. It was for her own sense of control. Mrs. Smith's plan to marry her off to James wasn't about finding Emily a loving partner. It was about securing her place in the family and ensuring that Emily would remain tied to the household, financially and emotionally. Emily's doubts started to creep in the more she spent time with Mrs. Smith and James. While James was a good man, hardworking, respectful, and sincere, he wasn't the person Emily wanted to spend the rest of her life with. She respected him, but she couldn't deny that she didn't feel the spark or excitement that would make her want to build a future together. James was a nice enough guy, but the more Emily thought about it, the more she realized they didn't share common interests or aspirations. He was content with his small-town life, working long hours in the mechanic shop, while Emily had ambitions of her own, ambitions that extended beyond the borders of the town and the limitations of a life defined by comfort and routine. What bothered Emily most, though, wasn't James's character. It was the way Mrs. Smith had been manipulating the situation. Mrs. Smith wasn't just matchmaking, she was controlling. Every conversation with her stepmother seemed to circle back to the idea that James was the perfect match for Emily, despite the fact that Emily never expressed any romantic interest in him. Mrs. Smith subtly praised James in a way that suggested he was her only option, telling Emily, "He's a good man, a dependable man, and that's more than you'll find with someone wealthy and distracted." It was clear to Emily that Mrs. Smith was pushing this marriage as a way to secure her own future, not Emily's. The tension between them grew with every passing day. Emily could no longer ignore the underlying manipulation in her stepmother's words. She had seen it before. The way Mrs. Smith subtly pressured her father to act in her favour, the way she made decisions that always benefited her. Mrs. Smith's need for control had driven a wedge between Emily and her. Emily realised that her stepmother's care for her wasn't entirely genuine. It was self-serving, masked under the guise of motherly concern. As Emily spent more time with James, her discomfort grew. He was a kind soul, someone who always had a smile on his face and a story to tell. But he was also content with the life he had, with no real ambition beyond his work at the shop. Emily found it increasingly difficult to relate to him, and though she tried to give the relationship a chance, she couldn't shake the feeling that marrying him would be a huge mistake. She didn't want to settle for a life of comfort and predictability when she felt like there was so much more out there for her. She couldn't envision a future with James, not because of any flaw in him, but because their lives simply didn't align. She wanted more than what he could offer. She wanted a partnership that was built on mutual respect and shared dreams, not a marriage of convenience or obligation. Emily began to feel trapped, not just by Mrs. Smith's pushy attitude, but by the societal pressure to settle down and get married. Everyone around her seemed to expect it, including her stepmother. But Emily's resistance grew stronger the more she thought about it. She knew that if she let her stepmother's plans come to fruition, she would lose control of her own life. Mrs. Smith's desire to marry her off wasn't out of concern for Emily's happiness. It was a way to maintain control over her and secure her own place in the family's wealth and legacy. The growing tension between Emily and Mrs. Smith became increasingly evident. Emily found herself withdrawing from the conversations about James, her responses becoming more curt, her interactions with her stepmother more strained. She began to confide in a few close friends, expressing her concerns about the pressure she was feeling. Her friends, who knew how strong-willed and independent Emily was, urged her to stand firm. They reminded her that her future was hers to choose, and she didn't have to settle for a life she didn't want just to make her stepmother happy. With every conversation, Emily's resolve grew stronger. She knew she couldn't let her stepmother control her future. Mrs. Smith's scheme, though well-intentioned in her own eyes, wasn't going to dictate Emily's life. Emily wasn't about to let anyone, especially her stepmother, choose her future for her. She would take control of her own destiny, and it would start with confronting her stepmother and putting an end to the manipulation. It was time for Emily to fight for the life she envisioned, even if it meant standing up to the person she had once tried to trust. Emily had finally reached a breaking point. The pressure from her stepmother had become unbearable, and the more Mrs. Smith pushed her toward James, the more Emily realized that she needed to regain control of her own life. She couldn't allow herself to be manipulated into a marriage she didn't want, especially not one designed to keep her under her stepmother's thumb. So, Emily decided to turn the tables on Mrs. Smith in a way she never anticipated. She would no longer be the passive pawn in her stepmother's plan. Emily had always been capable of independent thought, and it was that intelligence and independence that led her to her counterattack. She remembered a chance encounter with John, a wealthy but humble businessman she had met during a local community charity event. He was in his early 30s, intelligent, articulate, and seemed genuinely interested in the causes Emily cared about. Unlike the men Mrs. Smith had always praised, John didn't try to impress her with his wealth or status. Instead, he respected her for who she was, her intelligence, her passion, and her determination. Their conversation had been stimulating, and they found they had a lot in common. She admired his drive and his commitment to his business, but even more, she was drawn to his ability to treat her as an equal. In a world where most people seemed to view her as a beautiful young woman who needed saving, John saw her as a person with ideas and ambition. It was then that Emily realized, if she wanted to take control of her future, she needed to show Mrs. Smith that she could attract someone who truly valued her for who she was, not for her connection to wealth. Emily began to secretly cultivate her relationship with John, meeting him at social gatherings and quiet cafes, always keeping it low-key so that Mrs. Smith wouldn't catch on. Their relationship blossomed naturally, and with every passing week, Emily felt more confident in her decision to turn the tables. John treated her with the utmost respect, always valuing her opinions and encouraging her to pursue her own goals, whether they were personal or professional. He never pressured her into anything, never tried to manipulate her into marriage or anything else. Meanwhile, Mrs. Smith remained focused on pushing Emily toward James, still convinced that the simple mechanic was her best option. She saw James as a way to secure her own future by tying Emily down to a man who would never pose a financial or emotional threat to her. The thought that Emily might actually have other options, especially one as wealthy as John, was far from Mrs. Smith's mind. She continued to emphasize how perfect James was for Emily, how James would provide a life of stability, and how no one else would come along who would match him. Little did she know, Emily had already found someone who did. When Emily's relationship with John began to show signs of progress, Mrs. Smith couldn't ignore it any longer. She started to notice the subtle shifts in Emily's behavior, how she would now spend more time away from home, attending events or going out with a friend who Mrs. Smith hadn't met. Emily had always been somewhat reserved, but now she seemed more confident, more vibrant, and increasingly less interested in talking about James. The more Mrs. Smith asked about James, the more Emily seemed to brush the topic aside, much to Mrs. Smith's frustration. Emily's increasing confidence did not go unnoticed by her stepmother, who assumed that Emily was simply becoming more assertive in her own right. But when Mrs. Smith overheard a conversation between Emily and a family friend, where Emily casually mentioned John and the fact that she had been spending more time with him, she began to panic. Mrs. Smith had always believed that Emily would never be able to attract a wealthy, respectable man on her own, but Emily's growing closeness with John was the final blow to her carefully constructed plan. John was not only wealthy but also kind-hearted, humble, and genuinely interested in Emily's life and aspirations. He saw her as a person, not as a means to an end. The fact that Emily had captured his attention felt like a betrayal of everything Mrs. Smith had tried to orchestrate. Mrs. Smith's initial disbelief turned into jealousy and fear. How could Emily, who had been so easily pushed into considering a man like James, now turn her sights on someone like John? Mrs. Smith began to wonder if she had underestimated her stepdaughter's ability to control her own destiny. The more she observed Emily's growing relationship with John, the more desperate Mrs. Smith became. She could see that Emily was no longer the naive young woman she had once manipulated. Emily had grown stronger, and with the support of someone who truly respected her, she was starting to make choices that Mrs. Smith couldn't control. This was uncharted territory for Mrs. Smith. She had always manipulated people to achieve her goals, but Emily was proving to be different. Emily's ability to resist her stepmother's pressure and pursue a genuine relationship with someone who valued her for her independence was not only a blow to Mrs. Smith's plan, but also a personal defeat. Emily was no longer the vulnerable girl she could easily control. She had become a woman capable of making her own decisions and choosing her own future, whether or not Mrs. Smith approved. The truth couldn't be hidden forever. As Emily's relationship with John deepened and her confidence grew, Mrs. Smith's desperation began to show. She had tried every tactic in the book, subtle manipulations, gentle suggestions, and even outright pressure, but none of it had worked. Emily was no longer the timid young woman who would simply fall in line with her plans. Emily had grown stronger, and Mrs. Smith's control over her was slipping through her fingers. With John by her side, someone who truly respected her, Emily had found the courage to stand up for herself in ways she never had before. One afternoon, when Mrs. Smith made her usual attempts to undermine the relationship between Emily and John, Emily finally decided it was time to confront her stepmother once and for all. The moment had been building up for weeks, with the tension between them reaching a boiling point. Mrs. Smith, in a last-ditch effort to save her scheme, began to subtly disparage John. She implied that he wasn't really interested in Emily, that he was just after her money and connections, and that he would never be able to provide her with the kind of life she truly deserved. But this time, Emily wasn't going to let it slide. She had had enough of Mrs. Smith's manipulations. She stood tall, her voice calm but firm, and confronted her stepmother about her true intentions. "I know what you've been trying to do, and I'm not going to let you control my life any longer," Emily said, looking directly into Mrs. Smith's eyes. "You've been trying to marry me off to James to secure your own position, to make sure I don't get in the way of your plans. You never cared about my happiness, only about your own." For a moment, Mrs. Smith was stunned into silence. She had never expected Emily to confront her so openly, so directly. It was as if the young woman standing before her was a completely different person. no longer the passive, docile stepdaughter who could be easily manipulated. The silence between them was thick with tension as Mrs. Smith tried to regain her composure. But Emily wasn't done. She had to make sure that Mrs. Smith understood the full extent of her actions. "You've been controlling me for so long, and I've let you because I didn't know any better. But now I do. I know what you're up to, and I won't let you ruin my life." Mrs. Smith's face turned red with anger, her eyes narrowing as she realized the gravity of what Emily had just said. But instead of the defensive argument that Emily had expected, Mrs. Smith simply sneered, her voice cold. "You think you know better than me, don't you? You think you can do whatever you want, that you can just go off and marry some rich man like John. You're just a foolish girl, playing at love." At that moment, Emily's father, Mr. Smith, who had been unaware of his wife's scheming, walked into the room. He had overheard the conversation and could immediately sense the shift in the air. He stood there for a moment, taking in the situation, as Mrs. Smith quickly turned to face him. But it was too late for her to spin her lies. Emily, with John's support, had finally exposed her for what she was. Mr. Smith had always trusted his wife, but as he heard the truth about her manipulations, his expression changed. It was as if a veil had been lifted from his eyes, and for the first time, he saw his wife for what she truly was. A selfish, calculating woman who had used her own stepdaughter as a pawn in her own quest for power. The shock on his face was evident, and for a long moment he remained silent. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but firm. "I had no idea," he said quietly, his eyes turning to Emily with a new sense of understanding and regret. "I'm so sorry, Emily. I never should have let this go on." Mrs. Smith, realizing that she had lost control of the situation, tried to salvage her position. "You can't possibly believe her lies," she said, her voice trembling with desperation. "She's just trying to manipulate you. I've always had her best interests at heart." But Mr. Smith wasn't fooled. "No, I believe my daughter, and I can't ignore the truth anymore. You've shown me who you really are." The confrontation was over. Emily had fought back against her stepmother's manipulative nature, and now, for the first time, her father saw her strength and integrity. Mrs. Smith's control over the family was shattered, and Emily felt a sense of liberation she hadn't known before. In the aftermath of the confrontation, Mrs. Smith was left to face the consequences of her actions. She could no longer manipulate her husband or her stepdaughter, and her once secure position in the family was now uncertain. As for Emily, she knew that her life was hers to live. With John by her side, she felt empowered to pursue the future she had always wanted, one built on respect, love, and the freedom to choose her own path. And as Emily walked away from the confrontation, her heart was light. She had not only stood up to her stepmother, but had finally reclaimed control over her own life. Mrs. Smith's plan to marry her off to a poor man had backfired spectacularly, and Emily had come out victorious. In the aftermath of the dramatic confrontation, Mrs. Smith's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Word spread quickly throughout the community about the manipulations she had attempted, and soon her true nature was exposed for all to see. The people who had once respected her for her charm and elegance began to question her intentions, and her reputation, which she had built on lies and deceit, was irreparably damaged. Mr. Smith, devastated by the realization of his wife's manipulative behavior, began to distance himself from her. His once blind trust in her was shattered, and he found himself questioning every decision he had made under her influence. The shock of his wife's betrayal weighed heavily on him, but his realization of Emily's strength and honesty gave him hope for a new beginning. He started to spend more time with Emily, supporting her decisions and showing her the affection and understanding he had withheld for so long. Slowly, their bond began to heal, as Emily found herself able to trust him once more. Not as a passive observer, but as an active supporter of her choices. For Mrs. Smith, the fallout was swift and severe. Mr. Smith, once her most loyal ally, no longer wanted to be part of a marriage built on manipulation and deceit. As the truth came to light, Mrs. Smith found herself isolated and abandoned. The community, which had once admired her, began to distance themselves from her, unable to ignore the lies she had told. Her wealth and status, which she had used as tools for control, no longer mattered in the face of her exposed cruelty. With Mr. Smith turning his back on her, and the family she tried to control rejecting her, Mrs. Smith was left to face the consequences of her actions, alone and broken. For Emily, this moment marked a turning point. Free from her stepmother's control, she could now shape her own future. Her relationship with John grew stronger, built on a foundation of mutual respect and admiration. John had always valued her for who she truly was, an intelligent, independent woman who didn't need saving, but rather wanted a partner who would stand beside her. Emily felt a sense of liberation she had never experienced before. With John, she had found not just love, but an equal partner who saw her potential and encouraged her growth. They supported each other's ambitions, working together to build a life rooted in respect, honesty, and love. Emily's newfound independence extended beyond her relationship with John. She took a more active role in shaping her own future, pursuing opportunities that had once seemed out of reach due to her stepmother's influence. She decided to take on new professional challenges, using her intelligence and determination to create a career that was entirely her own. She also reconnected with old friends and began to form new relationships that were built on trust and mutual respect, no longer weighed down by the toxic influence of her stepmother. As the story drew to a close, Emily stood in her home, a place she now felt was truly hers, looking out the window toward a future filled with possibilities. The tension with Mrs. Smith was finally behind her, and she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. Emily had not only stood up to her stepmother's manipulations, but had also reclaimed her life and her happiness. Her relationship with her father, Mr. Smith, was also on the mend. As the truth came to light, he began to realize just how much damage his wife had caused. Emily's courage in standing up for herself had opened his eyes to the kind of woman his wife truly was. In the end, he began to support Emily in ways he never had before, becoming more involved in her life and her decisions. Their relationship grew stronger, built on a foundation of respect, trust, and a new understanding of one another. For Emily, the final scene was one of triumph. She had found the strength to resist her stepmother's influence, and in doing so, had created a brighter future for herself. Her journey was one of self-discovery, as she learned to trust her instincts, stand firm in her beliefs, and reject manipulation. The story ended with Emily stepping into a new chapter of her life, one where she was free to pursue her dreams and live on her own terms, no longer defined by her stepmother's manipulative grip, but by her own strength and independence. Key themes: manipulation versus independence. Emily's struggle to break free from her stepmother's control reflects the universal battle between manipulation and self-determination. The story highlights how manipulation can stifle a person's growth and how independence is the key to reclaiming one's future. Wealth versus character. The story explores the idea that love and character are far more important than material wealth. Emily's eventual choice of John, a man who values her for her intelligence and independence, proves that genuine connections matter more than status or money. Family conflict. At its core, the story delves into the complexities of family dynamics, showing how manipulation, jealousy, and control can fracture relationships. But it also demonstrates the possibility of healing when honesty, respect, and mutual understanding replace deceit and manipulation.